Eric rolled the small vial of golden liquid between his fingers. Unease settled into his nerves. Grand cheers, music, and acclaimed praise echoed in the hall above his chambers. The celebrations would proceed all night. The end of a war and an era was much to drink to. He threw back his head and took in the warm mead he had swiped from the hall before descending to his bower. He had his own demons haunting him this night. "You've had enough time," Fan had said while Eric waited in her chambers for the ink to dry. "Bring her in. Now." "There are complications," Eric had coolly answered. He hadn't told her of Gudrun, who had done well to hide herself from under earth, and he had no intentions to start. "Then take care of it," Fan said. "You have 3 days. Then I will interfere, and if I interfere, I won't be honoring our deal." Eric had long suspected that. The moment he passed Kallan into Fan's possession, her first act would be to kill Kallan. But her patience was wearing thin, and his excuses were dwindling. "And what of Danann?" Eric asked with hope to dissuade her. "Should they detect your presence in Lorlenalin? It's a risk I'm willing to take, should I be forced to take it." Fan had opened a small drawer from another bureau, and withdrew a small vial filled with a golden liquid. She held it to Eric, who eyed the small vial in question. "It's a tincture," Fan explained. "Undetectable, strong, and will leave Kallan incapacitated. It will also block her memory. She'll awake remembering very little. I think you underestimate Kallan's strength. And if I am, then Danann is closer to finding her than I thought, and Kallan should have been brought in years ago." Eric took the vial and turned to leave, his own thoughts reeling. "Eric!" He glanced over his shoulder, and Fan recovered that smile of hers as she eyed him hungrily. "Don't make me an enemy." A sudden bellow of laughter from above broke his thoughts, and Eric studied the golden elixir contained in the small vial. Gudrun. He hated the idea and hoped it wouldn't come to this, but he had no choice. Fan had him backed into the wall, but Gudrun was stubborn and oblivious to Fan's existence. Tell her. He had scolded himself too many times. But if Gudrun knew, she would put Kallan in more danger. Like her granddaughter, the old Sakona wouldn't sit idle while greater powers moved in. She would launch a war against Fan. He wouldn't agree. Gudrun would conflict with his plans. No. It was best if Gudrun didn't know. Eric continued to roll the vial between his fingers and ran his hand over his face, rubbing his eyes. No matter, in the end, he would transfer Kallan to Fan, and he was no fool. The moment his back was turned, Fan would kill her. But Kallan couldn't stay in Lorlenalin either, oblivious to Fan's pursuit. "Hi, Marshal." Eric's thoughts were too deep to notice the knock on the door. His scout stood worn and ragged with worry. "What is it?" "The Dark One has crossed our borders." "Just as expected," Eric nodded. "When?" "Only just." "How many?" "Nearly a dozen." 12? Eric furrowed his brow. 12 wasn't an attack. It was an infiltration. An idea cleared his worries like a streak of sunlight parting the clouds after a storm. "Does anyone else know of this?" he asked. The scout shook his head. "No, sir." "Very good." Eric eyed the vial, knowing the scout had seen. His markings were enough to keep Danann from finding him, and Gudrun had her own spells in place. But the moment Fan showed up, the chances of Danann finding them... Lorlenalin simply was too dangerous for Kallan to stay any longer. He had to get her out, and she wouldn't go willingly. "Report to Dagon," Eric said. "Have him ready the troops." "Yes, Marshal." The scout turned to leave. Raising his arm, Eric fired a bolt of save through the air and into the back of the scout's head. He slumped down dead before he touched the floor. Eric stared at the corpse. Kallan was to get out alive. Then his plan must work. And for that to be the case, then no one could know the Dark One had no army with him. The Dark One would come. He must have been guaranteed help to have brought so few to the enemy's gates. Eric narrowed his eyes. They won't come to the enemy's gates. Which leaves... Eric stepped over the body, then closed the door of his chambers behind him. After taking care to lock the door, he made his way to the stables. Kallan can't take on the Dark One alone, but as long as Gudrun and I are here, Fan can use our sea to mask her presence from Danann. Eric had no doubt Fan would come to Lorlenalin. She will kill us, and 2 dead Drui offered to Danann is enough to sate her curiosity and still keep Danann ignorant of Kallan. But Gunir has no Saith users. A presence in Gunir cannot be hidden. Band wouldn't be able to go near Gunir without Danon suspecting too much. As ironic as it all sounds, Kallan is safer in Gunir than anywhere else. But if the Dark One finds Kallan, he will kill her. Unless... Eric's thought turned to Gunir and King Rune. After studying the king's tactics and war strategies, he could almost predict Rune's next move. He was reportedly wiser, calmer, and if anyone was more likely to take Kallan alive, it would be Rune. He just might not kill her. With a king, Kallan stands a chance, and if anyone can command the Dark One, his king can. That leaves two complications. Gudrun and the entire Dolgafar army. The army is easy enough to take care of, as I command them, but no one commands Gudrun. Eric rolled the vial over in his hands and redirected his path to Gudrun's chambers. Branches stretched like brittle fingers across the black-blue sky as if the rustle in the wind was the only life left in Lorlenalin's forest. Bergen stared into the hollow darkness, glad to be free of the merciless sun's light. The scar above his right brow reflected the moonlight. His large black pupils, once silver blue, now consumed the whole of his eyes. He looked with ease beyond the obscurity that stretched from his seat in the dark wood to the highest visible peak of Lorlenalin. He had seen the mountain city only once before. In a fit of adventure seeking, he had ignored his father's laws and hiked across the forests of Alfheim. His journey came to a sour end at the base of Leafsfam Falls, where his father had been waiting. Bergen could rarely recall a more rigid beating. The Dark One stared at the thundering water. From a crevice buried above the lowest cloud, the water emerged. Under common conditions, like tonight, Leafsfam appeared to flow directly from the puffs of haze, as if the clouds themselves were forever emptying their contents into the pool below. A twinge of annoyance pricked his chest. He still had not climbed to the summit. Despite the long blade forged of saved stone sheathed on his back, Bergen's dark armor, heavily bristled chin, and black waist-length hair did well to hide him within the shadows. On his belt, next to a small pouch that contained his favorite pipe leaf, he sported a collection of blades, herbs, and medicinal leaves he found to be rather useful in a pinch. The solid clomp of Yorn's boot came from behind, and as alert as a sparrowhawk, Bergen looked about. Exhaustion pulled on the scout's face. If Bergen hadn't seen Yorn 1,000 times like this, wraith-like from the thick dusting that covered him after a long ride, he would not have recognized him. He was as ragged and rent as his men hidden in the forest where they waited for a signal. Always eager to skip the formalities, Bergen jumped to the only question that mattered. Is Rune alive? For now, Yorn said between breaths. The thin air must have left him battling for breath all day. The Queen signed his execution yesterday. He dies under tomorrow's moon. That doesn't give us much time, Bergen said. He shifted his gaze to the cloud, then looked again to Yorn. What of Borg? What has he decided? We're waiting on him now. If he can deliver an opening into the city, he'll hang a light at Leafsfam's pool. Yorn stretched a finger to the base of the falls, where the waters collected and at the river's head. We'll meet him there, and enter through the stables behind the falls. Bergen had been hunting for a speck of light when he looked back to the scout. Behind Leafsfam. Yorn nodded, catching the moonlight on his brow. There are only two ways in the city, the stables and the main gates, Yorn said. I suppose the main gate is out of the question, Bergen said, looking out to Lorlenalin's high walls with a bemused look as if he considered the possibility. The wind picked up, and Bergen breathed deeply, taking in the salty, sweet sea air. The water conceals a cave that's been converted into palace stables, Yorn said. A worn trail leads behind the falls. If you don't know to look for it, you won't see it. Once inside, you'll have one path to follow, a corridor that will take you to the barracks, the great hall, and the courtyard. You'll need to enter the prison through the barracks. Bergen nodded, taking in every word and gazing at the sea through the trees. And what of the army? Bergen said. Most have gathered in the great hall. They eat and drink to the end of the war. Yorn shook his head. They have no idea. And the Sidkona, where is she? Bergen said, staring at the Kattegat stretching to the horizon. Yorn's prolonged silence forced Bergen's attention. I asked Borg about the Queen, Yorn said, uncertain how to proceed. If she had her Sidkona with her, Yorn sighed, bringing himself to finish. The Queen is the Sidkona, Bergen. Bergen dropped his brow. What do you mean? He asked. The Queen doesn't have a Sidkona, Yorn said. The Sidkona, the one who gave you that scar, is the Queen. The Dark One shook his head, refusing to accept Yorn's claim. Too much didn't make sense. The princess was home, Bergen said. Always home. She stayed in the city while the old Sikona from Ersland fought alongside Eolf. Jorn was already shaking his head. Kallan never stayed home. It was she that King Olaf sent after us. But his own daughter, Bergen sputtered. Wasn't exactly helpless, if you recall, Jorn said with a subtle point to the scar branded on Bergen's brow. Bergen stood, his mouth agape, as he tried to piece Jorn's words together. Everyone had remembered the wide-eyed child in Lorlenalin's courts, peeking between Eolf's high seat pillars. And it was true, no one had actually seen the princess since King Tryggve first extended a hand for peace before. Bergen shook his head. Regardless, the memory of a sweet little thing too delicate to be troubled with pacified everyone's curiosity. When news reached Gunir that she had taken the throne, everyone had imagined a frail girl, barely strong enough to lift her father's sword, sitting in a throne so large it swallowed her whole. A vivid image of an oversized crown sinking to the shoulders of an adolescent came to everyone's mind, and they had all laughed. When Queen Kallan called in her father's troops as his battleship still burned, she had only reaffirmed their suspicions. No one had seen these attacks coming. Bergen recalled the safe flame that had grazed his brow, leaving him with a permanent mark that seemed to ignite his bloodlust. Her adamant, scornful look remained forever fixed in his head. Wielding a sword in one hand and a spell in the other, a wild ambition had blazed in her lapis blue eyes. The Sidkona had sparked a curiosity in him that dangerously toggled between his interests in ripened sexuality and his fear of feminine madness. "You're telling me that war maiden," Bergen said, that seed-wielding war wench is the queen." "She is." Trees bowed beneath the wind. "That softened little princess who sat unscathed in her daddy's citadel," Bergen said, "gave you that scar." Jorn finished for him. "Always there, always looking back now and then to send a bolt of fire up our asses." "Why didn't Borg tell us of this sooner?" Bergen forced himself from crying out. "I asked him the same thing," Jorn said. Bergen waited for a response. "Have we ever once asked about the queen before?" Jorn asked. "On the battlefront, we assumed the Sidkona was there fighting while the princess slept soundly in her bed at home. If we found the Sidkona, she would be alone without her queen, we thought." "No one had ever seen her majesty," Bergen said. "Save for King Tryggve, when Kallan was but a child," Jorn said. "Back when they were in Rakadet." The wind blew cold, and Bergen shook off the chill. "Do you think Rune knows?" Jorn asked after a moment. "We can ask him when this is over," Bergen said, forcing his composure back in place and gearing up for the task ahead. Looking back to the dark pool of water, they paused. The winds had settled for the moment, leaving the forest unusually silent. Clouds shifted, letting in a streak of moonlight that vanished before the winds picked up again. Bergen released a long sigh, keeping his eye on Leifsvon's pool. Still no lantern swayed in the dark. "Jorn," the scout looked to his commander, "if we are found and a skirmish breaks out, it will be the fight that ends this." Jorn stared at Bergen, listening to every word. "Should both monarchs fight, only one will live." Bergen walked along the forest's edge to look better upon the pool. Jorn nodded in understanding of the weight of the situation. Bergen exhaled, giving his attention to an elm tree bowed beneath the wind as he counted the odds against the unknowns. "And if we succeed?" Jorn asked. "What then?" The wind settled, easing off the trees, and leaving behind the most subtle of sounds in the darkness. "We find our own way in," Bergen said. Together they stared into the shadows, both heads spinning with worry. Neither spoke, leaving each to his own while they waited. Sensing the light before he saw it, Bergen shifted his gaze north. "There!" He pointed to the speck of light that glowed like a star from the water. With a fresh wave of restored hope, he glanced to Jorn, who took up his sword. Already the blood violently pumped through Bergen's veins. "Before the sun rises?" Bergen asked, grinning with a mischievous twinkle in his black eyes. Jorn nodded. "Before the sun rises."